Good afternoon. For those of you just joining, welcome to our community conversation on race, disability, and justice. And for those who participated in the earlier sessions, I'm sure you'll identify clear and compelling connections with the previous discussions and conversations. I'm Christy Ashby, Director of the Center on Disability and Inclusion and Associate Professor in the School of Education. This final session for today focuses specifically on educational systems and spaces, on the policing of bodies in schools. Our panelists and moderators bring a wealth of research and personal experience to the topic, and all recognize the necessity of intersectional approaches to this work, specifically focusing on the collusive forces of racism and ableism. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderators for this afternoon's panel, who will then introduce the three panelists. As a teacher educator and parent of two Syracuse City School graduates, I am thrilled that this panel is being moderated by two amazing local youth leaders. I have witnessed firsthand their passion, activism, and commitment to our local community. Our moderators for this afternoon are Sarhia Rahim and Shukri Mohamed. Sarhia Rahim is currently a senior enrolled at Syracuse Academy of Science. They have been heavily involved in the push to remove school resource officers from schools and seeking justice for victims of police brutality. They have helped start an organization called Raha Syracuse with the goal of bringing relief and uplift to their community. Other ways they have been active in the community is by sitting on the youth boards for both the Common Council and for Senator Rachel May. Thank you, Sarhia. And Shukri Mohamed is an alum from the Syracuse City School District, go Nottingham, and a youth community organizer. She is part of CUSE Youth BLM, a youth organization that hosted and participated in marches, protests, and panels in support of the Black Lives Movement in Syracuse. Additionally, she's part of the Alliances of Communities Transforming Syracuse Youth Council, which helps youth recognize the issues they face and work to tackle them, including preparing students for their post-high school endeavors. Currently, Shukri is a senior at Lemoyne College, double majoring in history and peace and global studies. I want to thank both of them for being part of this panel and for engaging our amazing set of panelists in this really productive conversation. So welcome, Sarhia and Shukri. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much. Our first panelist is Federico Waitoller. Federico Waitoller is an associate professor at the Department of Special Education at the University of Illinois at Chicago and Fulbright Fellow Professor at the Universidad, and I'm going to butcher this, I'm sorry, and Annamma de Barcelona. His research focuses on urban inclusive education and examines market-driven educational reforms and teacher learning and pedagogies. His latest book is titled Excluded by Choice, Urban Students with Disabilities in Education Marketplace, published in 2020 by Teachers College Record. In 2019, he was recipient of the Researcher of the Year Award, 2018, Rising Star in Social Sciences Award at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and in 2020, he received a Fulbright Fellowship.
Thank you, Ms. Ashby, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Sarhia, for starting us off. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Professor Subini Annamma, who is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. She has worked as special education teacher in both public schools and youth prisons. Her research critically examines the way students are criminalized and resist that criminalization via processes that animate entrenched inequalities while recognizing the mutually constitutive nature of racism and ableism, the interlocking with other marginalization oppressions, and how these intersections impact youth education trajectories in urban schools and youth prisons. Her book, The Pedagogy of Pathologization, focuses on the education trajectories of incarcerated disabled girls of color and has won the 2019 AESA Critics' Choice Book Award and 2018 NWSA Allison Pipemeyer Book Prize.
Our final panelist is Jessie Hagopian, is a high school ethnic studies teacher in Seattle, an editor for the Rethinking Schools magazine, and a campaign director for the Zine education projects Teach the Black Freedom Struggle. He is the co-editor of the books Black Lives Matter at School, An Uprising for Educational Justice, Teaching for Black Lives, Teacher Unions, and Social Justice, and the editor of More Than a Score, The New Uprising Against High Stakes Testing. Now we would like each of the panelists to give opening remarks. Please include your connections to these issues of policing in school and how did you come to this work? Can we start with Federico, please?
Yes, thank you so much for that great introduction, and thank you for the London Circle for inviting us in a very critical week. I mean, every week seems critical these days, but this may give us a space to make sense, understand, or at least heal, or find some community in these complicated times in so many ways. So I'm very thankful for the space, and I'm very honored and humbled to be around many bright and beautiful scholars and teachers. First, I would like to start by saying that I think of, and I would like to discuss policing beyond the concept of having police in schools or SROs, as they call them. You can have very strict policing, very damaging policing without police. Police in any case, they are just enforcers of ableist and racist school practice that has been part of DNA of public schools since the beginning, and that informs the ways that we make meaning of what it means to be a human being and a student and a learner in a school. If we should think about policing just having police presence in the schools, I think we fall short. I'm actually hopeful. I think at some point, at least some districts will define and will take off police out of schools. I know Minneapolis, Seattle, and I think Portland have committed to do so. I don't know in what stage is that of. I may be misinformed, but we may achieve that, and that might not be enough, because we will still have those ableist and racist policies and practice that someone else is going to end up reinforcing, because they're going to be there. They're part of DNA. So we need to also move to think about what are we policing? Because once we take that as the question, we can dismantle that. There is nothing to police. And we need to understand that even if we take, again, the police out of the question, those bodies out of schools, ableism and racism adopt and evolve. And therefore, there may be other ways of enforcing those ableist and racist practices. So with that in mind, I mean, I've been conducting research, particularly in the last 10 years in Chicago, and how Black and Latinx families experience school, marketized forms of education. And by that, I refer to school choice, charter schools, school closures, and different ideas from capitalism that inform the way that we deliver schooling in different districts. And what I found that is tightly that it relates to this issue is that safety and policing plays a role in a school choice in the way that not parents rationalize and make school choices, but also in the way some schools market themselves as heavens of safety and rigorous and disciplinary practice that at the end ended up being very damaging. And this is appealing also for parents, Black and Latinx parents of students with disabilities. And again, that doesn't mean that they are safe for them, but there is an enticement, there is a seduction that to draw them to those spaces. And through that reason, I think I learned two things, and this is just two aspects of the many things probably we're going to discuss today. One is that to understand policing, we need to understand the development of urban cities and urban geographies. We need to understand how urban spaces are produced through practices of capital expansion, from processes that are fraught with ableism and racism. And some of those examples include state sanction and corporate residential racial segregation, includes the segregation and disinvestment on people and students with disabilities, and includes the uneven geographical investments that are happening in many urban centers in the United States in where wealth is distributed mostly to white communities or communities that are primed for gentrification and abandoned for decades other communities. And that's what, in part, creates this discursive need for policing and for some communities to be contained, policed, and disciplined. So that's one thing. And the other thing that I would like to briefly mention is that this issue of safety and police, it's a way that schools market themselves and attract students. It's part of their market identity within the school market. And they sell themselves. It's very enticing to parents. And again, they ended up being very damaging and harming spaces, particularly those with zero tolerance policy. And I'll stop there, and I'll comment more later.
Thank you so much for that. Subini, would you like to go next?
Hi, everyone. I can't see any of you, but I assume you're all saying hi back. But hey, I'm Subini Annamma. It's nice to meet you all. I want to thank you all for inviting me to be here today. Thank you to Christy and Marcel and the Lender Center, and also thank you to our moderators. I was listening to y'all read those bios, and I was like, oh no, we could have cut those down. They didn't need to be quite so long, but y'all did valiant efforts on that. So thank you to that. I also want to recognize that I'm on the unceded lands of the Ramaytush people. And I also want to recognize the trauma that we've experienced this week with the extrajudicial executions of Dante Wright, Adam Toledo, Anthony Thompson Jr., and then of course those that go further back. And I'm specifically thinking about the Black and brown youth who've been murdered, including Tamir Rice, Ayanna Stanley Jones. So I just want to hold us in this moment because there has been a lot of trauma this week. And I think unless we invite that into the space and recognize it, there's no way we can talk about policing, right? It wouldn't be right. And I want to echo what Marcel Haddock said earlier in the first talk for Professor Morris or Monique Morris, when she said that we need to remember to breathe, take breaks, and give ourselves grace. So I just want to hold all of that and say, if this conversation gets too heavy for y'all, please feel free to walk away from the computer. Please go find joy for yourselves. We know that we are more than just our pain. We are also our joy but everything in between. So I'm sending each of you a lot of love today as we have this complicated conversation. So I came to this work through several moments, but the primary one is I came to this work through my students. As noted before I came to the academy, I was a public school teacher. Specifically, I was a special education teacher in large public urban schools. My students were majority Black and Latinx, and some would disappear from time to time, and they'd show back up and they'd say, Miss, I was in juvie, or Miss, can you call my probation officer and tell them I'm doing okay? Or Miss, someone else, another teacher is threatening to call my probation officer. And that's when I started to recognize very clearly the links between race, disability, and criminalization. And then I started to notice my own school and the practices that they enacted. So one of the public high schools I worked in, I'll just give this example real quick. One of the rules was when the bell rang, we were all supposed to close our doors and lock them. Now notice, lock them, not just close them, lock them. And then they would do hall sweeps and they would sweep the grounds. And any kid who was was not in a classroom and who didn't have a pass was not only given detention, but they were also given tickets for trespassing. So I just want to hold the ways that schools criminalize Black and brown youth, right? And so really recognizing that. So that's when I really started to make these connections. And then I decided to follow my students into youth prisons. And so I taught in both maximum security and step down programs. And what I found was what may be really obvious to some people, but was not obvious to me when I was in my 20s and just maybe not as sophisticated as all the rest of y'all were. But, I just really believed the stories that the kids in jail deserved to be there. They were there for our safety. That was the only way we were all going to make it, is by they were so different and so I really believed all that. And then I got into youth prisons and I found that that was not true. That these were just the same kids who had gotten caught in the system And the ways that they got caught is what I start to study when I went from being a teacher to being part of the academy. So I work with incarcerated youth. They tell me about their trajectories in the prisons. And similar to what Federico just said, I agree. Like, first, I do believe we need to get cops off campus. And I know that's what you're saying too. We need to get cops off campus, but we also need to extinguish the carceral logics that teachers have, right? That educators have, that administrators have. And that's not all teachers, right? This isn't the call out of all teachers, but it's a recognition that we all have been raised in in a carceral state, a state committed to criminalizing certain people. And if we know that, then we have to really dig in there. So I'll stop there for now, but thank you again for the invitation. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with these brilliant folks.
Well, hi, everybody. My name is Jesse Hagopian, and I greatly appreciate the opportunity to join this conversation. I've already learned a lot, so I'm glad I went third. And I appreciate the comments before, and I want to thank the Lender Center for sure and the youth moderating this panel. You know, they've talked a lot about learning loss this year, this deficit model approach to analyzing what students know. And I can tell you that the youth moderating this panel and so many others that I've worked with across the country and in my own school district are proving that deficit model very wrong, because they have learned so much this year about institutional racism, about the power of solidarity and collective struggle to push back against police violence. And so I want to thank you for your thoughtful questions and organizing this panel. I am coming to you from the unceded lands of the Duwamish people and the Coast Salish people here in the area now called Seattle, named after a Duwamish chief, and yet the Duwamish people still don't have federal recognition. And what a time to be having this conversation about police and schools. I mean, the framework for this conversation being the life of a 13-year-old boy really is the greatest argument there could be. More powerful than anything that we're going to say today is the behavior of the police themselves towards our children. It's sickening to me. And, you know, it first turned my stomach when I started teaching in Washington, D.C. back in 2001. And I would drive by the White House on my way to work. And about 10 minutes later, I would be in Anacostia in Southeast DC, one of the most impoverished and segregated neighborhoods in the country. And, you know, the first day I ever was a teacher, I gave my 5th grade students an assignment to take a brown paper bag home with them and to put an item in that bag that truly told me something about who they were. And I told them, don't just put your favorite video game in it. Put something that really explains something about who you are as a person. And I don't know if I was ready to ask that question. I know that I wasn't ready to ask that question, because when we came back the next day, we were in a circle and the first girl pulled a plastic card out of the bag and held it up for the class, and she turned it over. It was her dad's driver's license, and she said she carried it with her everywhere now because he was locked in prison. And the next boy pulled out a picture of his father who had been killed that summer. And we went around the room and everybody had a t-shirt or a photo or some memento of a loved one who was either dead or in jail. I was just in a panic. You know, I had no idea how I was going to meet the social and emotional needs of these students. And I got the greatest education I could have ever got. I got taught way more than I ever was able to teach the students, because I learned the truth of what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls the violence of organized abandonment. And I had, you know, she talks about the violence of organized abandonment being the disinvestment in our communities and the investment in policing, right? And I saw that in a really brutal way. And it was really driven home for me one day. The first research assignment I ever assigned was for students to research someone that they valued from history that had helped make the world better. And they created these posters and they came in and turned them in, and we were going to present on them the next day. But when we came into the classroom the next day, there was a ½ inch of standing water all over the classroom floor. And the posters had been destroyed by the rain because we found out there was a hole in the ceiling of my classroom. And so the students were never able to present their posters. They were completely destroyed. And it was not long after that that the attacks of 9/11 occurred, and we could see the smoke from the Pentagon rising from my classroom. And, you know, that was scary. But I think even more terrifying for me was the fact that our government could mobilize untold billions of dollars of resources to go bomb people halfway around the world, but couldn't fix the hole in the ceiling of my classroom just a few minutes away from the White House. And that hole was in there for the 3 years I taught in DC. I had to put an industrial sized garbage can under that hole and it would just fill up. Right. And that to me is a metaphor for this country. We disinvest from everything that matters about our kids. And, you know, on many instances, I would go into the hallway and see police jacking up kids against the wall, screaming at them. One time I saw them put a 4th grade student into the back of their car, yelling at this kid, "I arrested your dad yesterday and you're going to be next if you don't straighten up." And this is the kind of regular abuse that's happening in schools across this country. And it's why I'm really proud to be part of the Black Lives Matter at School movement. Incredible educators, students, and parents from all over the country who are working to remove police from schools. And not only removing police from schools, but also removing the violence of organized forgetting, as Henry Giroux calls it, the marginalization of Black and brown people from the curriculum. So I'll leave it there, but I appreciate you all for your time today.
Thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your stories on how you came to be where you are today. I think all of your stories show the different ways in which a person can come to this moment of talking about police and policed bodies, especially in schools. And with that, we'd like to ask the first question that touches on all of the different spaces that you all come from, which is, who exactly is being protected by police officers in schools? And we'll start with Professor Federico. Professor, you're muted.
Or someone needed to talk muted. It's a Zoom meeting, that gotta happen, right? So, and of course it's gonna be me. Thank you for the question. Who is protected? You know, I was thinking about this question, you know, and when you look at broad scale research, we know that having police in schools increases school suspension, increases disciplinary action, decreases school graduation, and decreases college enrollment. So definitely not all those students are benefiting from having police in schools. So the other flip to that question, I may take the liberties of rephrase the question. To me, it's of course, who is protected? I think it's very interesting. But it was even to me more interesting, what is being protected by having police in schools? as I mentioned before, is we have a school system that is damaging in general. I mean, there are exceptions. I don't want to be totally generalizing across every teacher in a school. There are good schools, there are welcoming schools. But in general, and throughout history, we have schools that have been very damaging for minoritized students, particularly those who embody intersecting forms of oppression, of marginalization. And what is protected is this DNA, this racist and ableist DNA that informs the ways that we think about what it means to be a student, what it means to be participating, what it means to be a learning, what it means to be a human being period in a school who supports and privilege white supremacy. It's an image based on white middle class cisgender forms of being. And I think that's what's being protected. And if you deviate from that, you need to face the consequences. And that is containment, that is punishment, that is segregation. So there is importance to see the who, but we also need to think about what is this police being protected, are protecting. I'm losing my English these days, sorry.
Can we just jump in, or do the moderators want to call on us? What would you prefer?
You can just jump right in.
Okay, bet. First of all, yes, I appreciate Jesse's noting the regular abuse of police in schools of kids. And I want to touch on the extrajudicial execution of Anthony Thompson Jr., who just this week was shot by the police in his high school bathroom. And the story is already changing. Just like its story of Adam Toledo, the story is already changing. So we know that police lie, right? Like we can show the examples of how they lie, when they lie, and how, and the idea that they just made an error is oversimplification of historical implications that show us that police lie in order to frame a story a particular way. So again, he originally, they said Thompson Jr. shot a policeman. Now they're saying that bullet wasn't from him. Now there's a question if even if there was a gun that he had, similar to Toledo, who did not have a gun pointed at the police when they said they shot him. So again, just note that to start with. But I also just want to point out, as a Black boy, Thompson's case is not unusual. Black youth are 6 times more likely, and Latinx youth are almost 3 times more likely to die from police shooting than white children. So ultimately, research simply does not show police in schools and keep kids safer or protect them. And in fact, it illustrates how youth of color and Black youth specifically are not made safer by police in schools. And again, to be clear, no one is protected by police in schools. Not Black children, not Indigenous children, not Latinx or Asian children, and not even white children. I don't want white children to die from police shootings either. White children like Peyton Ham, who was just shot by the police recently. But even if they are not shot or attacked by police, having police in schools teach white children that they must tolerate a violent force surrounding them to keep them safe, or to have a sense of safety from Black and brown youth by police who do not protect them either. And dang, Federico, reminding us what is being protected, right? The property of whiteness, and ability, like the different things that are being protected by police, that are not in the best interests of kids or adults, right? That is the idea that we need to have the threat of violence hanging over us in order to be safe to learn. That's what police in schools are telling us. That's what we need. We need to be threatened constantly that if you do not fall into line, you will be physically or emotionally abused. So I appreciate both of the panelists here pointing this out. And because I'm an academic and annoying as all can be, right? You give me a question like Federico, so I'm calling Federico out in this too, because I know him and I can make fun of him. But right, I want to shift the question. So I don't want to just talk about who is made safer by police, but I want to flip that question to say, who do police target? Because to me, that question is just as important, and in fact, maybe even more important. So my concern is not just that police do not make it safer, it is that they target youth of color at the margins. specifically the targeting of disabled Black boys and girls and queer and trans youth of color. These are the kids most at risk for harassment and punishment by police. Disabled Black girls have been targeted and harassed not just incidentally, but because of their differences. And I'm going to keep hitting on this. I'll talk about this in the next question too, so I'll talk about that more. But that's how ableism and racism work together. When a society imagines each difference from the norm as a deficit that is not worthy of education or care, but only criminalization. So that's why I have supported police-free schools, cops off campus, because carceral logics that run through policing, right? And that's thinking that is about labeling, surveillance, punishment. That's what I mean when I say carceral logics that's running through policing means that multiply marginalized youth of color will always be targeted.
Yes, absolutely. I appreciate all of that. And I completely agree that police are in schools not to protect children, but to protect a system of inequality and oppression that we have, right? We know from the research that a first-time arrest doubles the odd that a student will drop out of high school, and a first-time court appearance quadruples the odds, okay? So the police in schools are about targeting specifically marginalized students. And I appreciate the intersectional approach that we're taking in this panel to understand that, yes, it's Black and brown students who are targeted. And then within that, like Monique Morris has pointed out so importantly, that Black girls are the most over suspended in our schools at some 6 or 7 times the rate of white girls, right? That Black trans kids are over policed and punished in our schools, and Black students with disabilities as well, right? And so, you know, some 60% of arrests in the schools are of Black and Latinx students, right? And we can look at those numbers, but I think we also have to drill down and see the specifics. So if people have seen the case in Florida of the 6-year-old girl last year who was having a temper tantrum in class. Now, a temper tantrum is a developmentally appropriate behavior for a 6-year-old student. But instead of seeing that child, as a human being, they saw that child as a threat and as a criminal from the age of 6. And so the police officer arrested her. And there's a heartbreaking video of him dragging her to his police car. And she's screaming, "Please let me have a second chance." In this country, we reserve second chances for investment bankers who sabotage the global economy. We reserve second chances for police officers who shoot people 7 times in the back, like the officer who shot Jacob Blake and is now back on the streets patrolling in Kenosha, right? We don't give second chances to 6-year-old Black girls who are having developmentally appropriate behavior. And she got thrown in the back of that car, driven to a youth jail where she was fingerprinted and had her mugshot taken, right? And her grandmother came and picked her up and explained that she was suffering from sleep apnea, and that's why she was having a difficult time in school. But instead of the school figuring out how do we nurture and support and love this child, right, was concerned with how do we punish this child, right? And there's just too many stories like this to recount. I mean, we could talk about the 11-year-old girl, Black girl, who's thrown into a brick wall by the police in New Mexico. The video showing that as well. And the officer said that she had taken an extra carton of milk from the cafeteria, right? And that's why he had to brutalize her. And this is happening in school building after school building all across the country. And things that used to be normal child behavior that was part of growing up are now being criminalized. So in my own home state, there was a 15-year-old boy named Caleb who discharged fart spray in school, right? Okay, that was a dumb thing to do. I will say that. I would be irritated too as a teacher in the school building, right? But could we laugh a little bit about how just like silly that was and how much that kid has to grow up, right? But instead, this child was arrested and he was charged with felony assault, right? And people's entire lives are then destroyed by the over-policing of kids in our schools. And so that's why we're fighting for police-free schools. That's why Black Lives Matter at School has one of our demands, counselors, not cops, right? We want care workers in our schools, not violence workers.
So our next question is, have police officers always been in schools? What is the history of police in schools? And we'll start with Jesse.
Sure. Well, police in schools, they have not always been in schools. Really, the emergence of the over-policing of youth shows up with the Great Migration, as many Black families are trying to escape the terrorism of the Jim Crow South and coming to the North. You know, there was a great anxiety amongst white America about Black people coming into their cities. And that anxiety made politicians move to over policing mostly Black and brown students in the schools that they were coming to. And, you know, you can see this in city after city. They begin to have police show up in the schools there in the 40s and 50s, but really from 1999 to 2005, police presence in schools just exploded across the country as the federal program called COPS spent more than $750 million to place police in schools. And now, today, we have security officers and cops outnumbering counselors in 3 of the 5 biggest school districts in the US. And we have some 14 million students in the United States attend a school where there is a cop, but there's not one of the following: a counselor, a school nurse, a school psychologist, or a social worker. And that's just the clearest example of how our country is perfectly comfortable investing in the criminalization, in the push out and the locking up of our youth, and not investing in their futures.
I mean, you guys don't all have to talk at once, but I'll start. Subini, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you, Jesse, for that broad that overview. That's why I was just kind of sitting there, because I'm like, well, he said it all. I mean, I can repeat it, but like, I mean, I think, you know, the other thing is really, the more we know our history, I think the stronger chance we have of understanding how these things get sedimented in policy and practice over time. So I'm not going to talk about cops, but I'm going to talk about something else that's related to cops, right? Which is, so at one point, one of the things that's really interesting, so at one point we looked at Colorado in particular, and we found that really that Colorado codified or made legal the suspension of kids, which is kicking kids out of school, right around the time that they were finally integrating. Because remember, you know, Brown versus Board happened in 1954. So I think a lot of us are like, well, that happened in the 50s. But if we know our history, that Colorado and many states, not just Colorado, but many states put off integration till the 70s, I mean, busing is still happening in the 80s. And of course, remember, now it's gone backwards and we are even more segregated. But with that being said, so when Colorado amended its constitution so it could legally suspend kids, that was right at the same time that integration was happening. Well, guess what else was happening at the time? That's when special education was being created. And now I want to give a nod, of course, to the people who fought for the rights for disabled kids to be in public schools, right? That was what the fight for special education was for. So I do want to notice that and acknowledge it as an important set of rights that kids were fighting for educationally. But I also want to acknowledge that since special education has come into public schools, it has almost always been overrepresented in particular categories. So different categories. So there are certain categories that tend to close off access for kids to general education and then the supports within. And there are categories that tend to send kids down in particular ways. So an example of that is, right, the category of emotional disability. So that category is grossly overrepresented of Black and brown youth, mainly Black youth, but also Latinx and Asian in some different parts of the country, but mainly Black youth, right? Black youth are overrepresented in the category of emotional disability. Well, guess what? In youth prisons, there are almost of all the kids with disabilities in youth prisons. So first of all, there's a high number of kids with disabilities in youth prisons if we don't know that. So we should know that, but almost 50% of them are kids with emotional disabilities. So, and we can guess that many of those kids are Black. Now we don't know that because we don't collect intersectional data in our youth prisons, something we need to change. Side note, anyone here who's got money and wants to give me some to fix that. But I think, so the reason I'm bringing it up is because I want us to remember what Federico talked about earlier, which is, yes, school resource officers and police in schools is important to get rid of, but we also want to think about care work, care workers that Jesse mentioned being so important, but we also need to make sure that the teachers and counselors are indeed care workers. Because one of the things that's happened is that, like the example he gave, right? And so many of the examples we've already talked about of police violence happening to kids in school, an educator called that SRO. An educator called the police. They have decided that we are no longer going to take care of our kids and their issues, and we're gonna farm them out to police. Now, again, I want to be clear that I don't think that's an educator responsibility, that they should have to do that on their own. Schools have created a situation where there is less and less time to give the care kids need. And so more and more stuff has to get pushed out to other people. So I understand how it happens. So I don't think it's an indictment of teachers and counselors. I think it's an indictment of teacher education programs. I think teacher education programs have a huge role to play in how much they've failed to teach teachers how to care for kids. They've failed to recruit Black and brown teachers that care for kids. They've failed in a number of ways. And then that is not, of course, there's multiple places that there are failures in the system. But what I do, I want to name the fact that educators are choosing to link with police. And I want to not put it all on their shoulders when they make that choice, but I want them to rethink that choice when we can.
Thank you, Subini. And I mean, so much has been said and in such an eloquent way. I mean, I just felt like summarizing and expanding on some what the prior panelists say, Jesse and Subini. I think the omnipresence of police bodies in schools may be something, as Jesse says, picking up in the late 1990s and 2000. But the history of policing in a school goes back to the birth of public education. Schools have always been on the business of containing, separating, and disciplining those bodies who do not conform with those normative ways that schools expect you to be, and those are highly informed by ideas of white supremacy from the beginning of public schooling. So policing is new, police is new, policing, it goes way back into the DNA and history of public schools.
Thank you so much. Our follow-up question is, what are SROs compared with security officers compared with sworn police officers? What are their roles in schools? And again, we'll start with Jesse.
Sure. It's basically rebranding efforts. And when you say there's cops in schools, it sounds more intimidating and people might be less comfortable having cops in schools. So school resource officer sounds more gentle, like it's a resource for your community. But it's just a cop, and it's a cop with no extra training. As it's not that training actually has been shown to help much at all anyway, right? But you know, they don't even they're not even asked to necessarily, in many school districts, have any sort of sensitivity towards being around students. They're just cops, like the cops that are out on the beat patrolling and harassing Black and brown communities, and they take one of those officers and put them in a school. And there are nicer officers and worse officers everywhere. There are schools that have nicer officers who behave better than others. To me, that is not an argument for keeping officers in schools, because as some students have told me, when they see the officer the officer who was in our school, there's a high amount of anxiety that they have had because they had negative interactions with police for many years, or their parents have, and it's just passing by them in the hallway is a traumatic experience, right? And you know, whenever you place somebody in a situation where there's absolutely no accountability, where you can murder someone in cold blood on video and you know that there will be no consequences for any of your actions, you can't have someone like that around children, right? I mean, I would argue that you can't have someone like that in a society at all, right? That actually we need to rethink public safety altogether, right? That actually we know that the safest communities are not those with the most police, but those with the most resources. And the same is true with our schools. We need to remove these SROs who are just cops with a nicer name, because training has not worked in the broader community. It hasn't worked in our schools, and we need to begin. Maybe it's easier to abolish the police in schools, but we've done that starting in Minneapolis. Then it spread to St. Paul and Denver and Oakland public schools. I'm proud to say that two incredible young women here in Seattle started a petition to remove the police, and they got some 14,000 signatures in just a couple days. And that was important pressure that helped remove the police from the Seattle public schools. So, you know, I'm for abolishing the police in schools, and maybe that's a first step. But, you know, if we can show that our schools are safer without them, well, it's also true that our neighborhoods and our communities are safer without them. And when we invest in housing and healthcare and in an education and conflict resolution and transformative justice programs, we don't need police anywhere, whether in our schools or beyond.
There was an interesting comment, Jesse, and probably you know better than I do, that there is a difference between the SROs even in urban and suburban areas. Mm. I don't know if you wanted to speak with that, but I just read that comment. And
yeah, I mean, when you look at the over-policing of Black and brown students, then you see the specific role that SROs play in training children to accept their role in life, right? So in Black and brown schools, police are there to train children to accept their position as a criminal from a young age, right? Think of that 6-year-old girl I just told you about, right? She is trained from that age to see herself as a criminal and to accept her community as accept the mass incarceration of her community. So in that way, the SROs are educators. It's just a really cynical form of education that's preparing them for a deeply inequitable world. And SROs in you know, white middle class areas sometimes are there because parents say, well, we want someone to protect our kids from school shootings, but they don't have much to do with brutalizing the students at the school.
I want to highlight some of the things you say, Jesse, particularly with how we decide to invest resources and how we invest those resources differentially, even within cities. I was about to say here in Chicago, but I'm not in Chicago. I lived 10 years and I'm still doing research here in Chicago. I'm currently in Spain. But there in Chicago, there is a huge difference in where funds are used for policing and metal detectors and punishing measures and for developing and promoting schools that are based on very punitive practices like zero tolerance schools and these charter schools that are based on zero tolerance models. And at the same time, a mile away, the same amount of resources are invested in these beautiful selective enrollment schools with huge resources, various special educators, counselors, very after-school programs, and all the things that we think every student should have. But those schools are located either in wide areas of the city or in areas that have the potential for gentrification, right? To draw people into those areas. So we also distribute investment sometimes very unevenly, but sometimes we use it in very uneven ways with Black and brown communities and with other communities within like miles of difference or even blocks of difference within the same city.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is, I've been thinking a lot while you two are talking, because you're really making important points about public schools, about charter schools, about selective enrollment schools. But I also want us to think about schools and youth prisons. So what would have happened if Adam Toledo or Anthony Thompson Jr. had not been shot? They most likely would have been sucked into the juvenile legal system. And I don't talk about it as a justice system, like many people, like Andrea Ritchie, like just many folks who would say that there is no justice in these systems. So we talk about them as legal systems, right? And I don't know if you all know this, and I only learned it when I became a teacher, and I write about it as a researcher because I think it's so important to understand. In a youth prison, in most places, a pencil is considered a weapon. So most times when you go into a youth prison classroom, and remember, education is mandated. Kids have to go to school when they're in prison. So there are teachers, there are classrooms, the whole thing. But like pencils are considered weapons. So what happens is there's usually a something that has holes in it, and you put your 12 pencils in the block, whether it's shaped like an apple or some other weird thing. And you count them at the beginning of every class, and then you count them at the end. And if a pencil goes missing, there's a strip search. So I want you to think about the fact that not only are we investing and disinvesting in ways, because what we're doing when we do that organized abandonment that Jesse reminded us, that Ruth Wilson Gilmore teaches us about, we also do a specific kind of investment. We take that money and put it somewhere. It's not like it goes back to the community. We take that money and put it in youth prisons. It costs so much more to keep a kid in a youth prison than it does to educate them. If we actually took the money that we spent on youth prisons, we could actually have we could have a completely different education system. So there's that. But there's also the fact that in those places, tools of learning like pencils are considered weapons. What are we training kids for when we send them to a place where tools of learning are considered a weapon? I think, so again, I know we're getting kind of far from the question, but I just think like this idea of investment and disinvestment and abandonment and where we reinvest is really important to also acknowledge, because as we're talking about how we need to get cops out of schools, I want us to also think about how we get kids out of jails I want us to think about abolition and abolition of youth prisons. Of course, I want abolition of all prisons, but I feel like, how is it not obvious that we need an abolition of youth prisons? Like, how can anybody hear that if you lose a pencil, you literally get strip searched and be okay with that being the way some of us get educated?
Absolutely. And you are not getting further from the question. That actually goes really well into our next question, that talks a little bit about, so what exactly is the school to prison pipeline, and how do police officers play a role in it? And how does it include race and disability and students who are, disabled and Black, and the way that, the intersection works between those two. So again, the question is, what is the school to prison pipeline, and how do police officers play a role, and how does it include race and disability? And we'll start with Professor Subini.
Woo, that's a big question. Yo, all right, I'm gonna do a little bit and then I'll pass it on and we'll jump back and forth, because I know everybody's got great answers to this, okay? And I know we're all thinking about it. The reason I really appreciate this panel is because we're thinking about it from different points, but we're all coming to the same conclusion. So I want us to note how close we are in our conclusions, even though we all have these different experiences. It's really powerful to me. So thank you for being so thoughtful of these questions. So I'm going to start with a piece on racism and ableism, and then I'm going to jump over to the school prison pipeline, because I think they're really important. So being a youth of color means you will be subjected to both racism and ableism. That is, if racism is the ranking of people by race, the ableism is how we are ranked. Youth of color are assumed to be less than in behavior and learning. So automatically, it's more than just deficit thinking, it's built into systems. And we see all of the outcomes of this, right? The unequal ways of who has access to advanced and gifted and talented and who ends up in special ed. I mean, right there, we start to see how ableism impacts all youth of color. So I want to make that clear first. And that's why racism and ableism are interdependent. What I mean when I say that are mutually constitutive. I love to say that word, but people are like, what does that mean? It just means that they need each other, that you can't have racism without ableism. They depend on each other, right? And what that means, though, is that racism and ableism are exacerbated for disabled youth of color. So what I mean by that is disability is used as an additional rationale for segregation and exclusion. So if I told you I was going to segregate all the Black kids in your school, I hope y'all would be like, oh no, we need to stop that immediately. But if I tell you, well, they all have a disability label, suddenly everyone's like, oh, well, that's okay, right? We suddenly get real complacent because we think disability means all of what you cannot do. And so when we start to define disability by deficit, we start to get into a place where all we define kids by is what they cannot do. So first, I just want us to think about that and really think about if that is comfortable for us. Because the other thing that happens a lot when we start talking about special education and we start talking about this thing called disproportionality, right? When there's an overrepresentation, there's more Black kids than should be by their population. So if there's 14% of Black kids in school and there's 28% of Black kids in special ed, that's disproportionate. But if we want to make it, the argument against overrepresentation is like, well, we should just have proportional representation. 14% of Black kids, 14% in special ed. But what I keep coming back to is, but the problem is we still segregate. We still say once you're in special ed, you get remedial curriculum, you get problematic pedagogy, lots of worksheets and coloring and lots of reduction, lots of repeating things that you've been learning for 5 or 6 years. And you get retributive relationships. And what I mean by that is punishing relationships. So again, we have to decide, and to be clear, this doesn't, like, research shows that if you look at kids with the same disability label, white kids with the same disability label are more likely to be included in the general education class with support, and Black and brown youth are more likely to be segregated. So again, we are seeing a distinct concern between racism and ableism, and particularly how they impact disabled kids of color. But it goes even further than that. And one of the things that we argue is that disabled youth of color are targeted for behaviors that are related to their disability label. But you're not supposed to be. The whole point of getting a disability label is you're supposed to be supported in those things. So the example that Jesse gave of Kaya, the 6-year-old Black girl who got arrested in Florida, which is the same one that I was going to refer to. So thanks for stealing my thunder. kidding. But like, so she, like, as he said, she got in trouble for having a tantrum, which all 6-year-olds have tantrums, first of all. I've got an almost 5-year-old, and go girl. Woo, those tantrums, they're real. But also, the sleep apnea meant that she's not getting an appropriate amount of sleep. Anyone else crabby when they don't get enough sleep? What about a 6-year-old who cannot control their emotions and now has sleep apnea on top of it? So she's actually getting punished for something related to her disability. And another example is Grace, the 15-year-old that right at the beginning of the pandemic she ended up, they called it a violation of her probation because she didn't do her homework. I don't know if you all remember this, but if you don't, look it up. And what happened is that we started looking into it, and Grace had ADHD. Well, ADHD can make you have struggle with time, can have you be disorganized, can have you be exhausted, right? So all those things. So again, she's getting punished for things that were actually part of that could have been related to her disability. So again, what we see is that disability labels don't protect kids of color the way that we argue the whole need for them is. Because also, what else is the point of a disability label, right? It's supposed to, at least in schools, give you certain protections and certain supports. But that's not what we see happening. And when Monique Morris, I really appreciated that she pointed out that, you know, Black girls do experience this vast overrepresentation. I think it like in 2016, 2017, it was about 6%. They were 6 times more likely. They were like 12% of suspensions, whereas white girls were 2%. So they were like 6 times more likely. Black girls with disabilities, 20%. So they're getting suspended at even higher rates. So we need to be able to recognize how this kind of intersectional analysis, where we look at multiple marginalizations, is so, so important, because again, it's the kids, it's all youth of color, but especially the kids on the margin of that label. And we could do the same thing with the way that trans youth are being criminalized. We could talk in the same kind of complex conversations around them. So racism and ableism work together, and race and disability work together. And then real quickly, because I know I'm starting to, but school to prison pipeline. Monique talked about this too. We both agree on this, that these things don't work together, that the original conception of them was from activists and from scholars who were like, listen, you need to link the ways kids are getting criminalized to how they end up in prison. So really important work. So I want to recognize that the origins of that term were super useful. But as we started to study the school prison pipeline more, what we saw was it's not just a straight path, right? So I worked with incarcerated kids, and the amount of them that told me the first interaction they had with police was getting taken away from their parents. So they were in the welfare system or the child welfare system, right? And then there's kids who are the undocumented, right? So they've got ICE and other systems that are working with them. And so we actually see that there's these multiple institutions in our whole society that work on criminalizing particular people, kids that we have decided are on the margins. And so that's why I talk about it as the school prison nexus, because a nexus talks about a web of things, right? It's a web of institutions, and they all work together to criminalize particular kids. So that's how I think of that, though I know different people think of it differently.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Thank you so much, Subini. I just learned a lot, especially about discipline in relation to the overlapping identities of students of color and with disabilities that is going to be really helpful to me in explaining this better. So I appreciate that. You know, I also think the concept of the school to prison nexus is so important, and that includes the ways that our schools are increasingly resembling prisons themselves before the kids even get shipped into the pipeline, right? So the metal detectors, the random searches in our schools are examples of that. And just a few weeks ago here in Seattle, an investigative reporter uncovered a story that's truly heartbreaking that happened in one of our schools that shows how this nexus is working. And this 2nd grade boy, and I have a 2nd grader myself, so this really hit home. He was being taken into a place they call the cage at his school. And the principal was having this boy who was suffering from PTSD and had special education services. And they were taking him and locking him in this outdoor facility called the cage. And kids during lunch would walk by and laugh and point at this predominantly white school. And they would open the cage and slide him his food during lunch. And he ate it on the cold, hard concrete because they didn't even give him a desk to sit in. And so he was on display for the entire school population to walk by and laugh and point while he was locked away in this place. And as bad as that is, right? You know, you want to get incredibly angry at that principal who allowed that to happen, and that's justified. But it's worse. There was a Black teacher who saw this happening and reported it to the school district, and the school district conducted an investigation and allowed it to continue, right? That's when you realize this problem is not an individual problem. It's a structural problem, and it's an institutional problem. And we have to change structures and institutions, not just replace individuals, right? And I'll just wrap up by saying that just a couple blocks from the high school that I teach at, they just opened a brand new $200 million jail for kids, right? And this brand new youth jail siphoned off money that could have gone to care workers, right? I live in one of the wealthiest places the world has ever known. We have Amazon, Microsoft, Starbucks, Boeing. We have the two richest people who have ever walked the planet in Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates. And we don't have a nurse in every school every day, right? During a global pandemic, are you kidding me, right? These are the priorities of a capitalist system that is about enriching the very few at the expense of the rest of us. And how do they get away with having 5 people on the planet have the same amount of wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion people? The only way that you can maintain a society with that level of inequality is, number one, by convincing people that they are in their right place, that there are some special people that should have that wealth and the rest of us should suffer. And that is one of the roles of a school system, in convincing people that society is set up in a just way. And that's why people don't learn the history of the Black freedom struggle and movements against oppression in proper ways in school, right? And then the other way is when that ideological violence breaks down and people see through the lies that they were taught in school about freedom and justice for all in this country. Then you have the police ready, right, to beat back those people who are organizing for a different society. And that's really why our kids are being funneled into the school system instead of supported.
Thank you, Jesse and Subini. And by the way, I think Subini put a link. I don't know if everybody can see it. I'm not sure how the chat works, but it's a case on Illinois. Was, if I'm not mistaken, it's a couple of years ago, an investigation by ProPublica. I think in combination either with the Tribune, the NPR, I don't remember, but of kids, kids with disabilities put in these time-out rooms for periods of time. And the trigger warning, the quotes from the kids yelling outside the room are incredible, and it frees your blood. But just wanted to mention that, and I want to relate what both Jesse and Subini have said with some of the latest work that I've done with zero tolerance charter schools in two ways. One to think about this relationship of race and disability, and the ways that we, as Subini was saying, we create in schools in very that deliver very narrow ways of participating and learning based on white supremacy that particularly affects in qualitatively different ways Black and brown students with disabilities, but also the consequences of that. That I think it goes, of course, beyond prison life. So I give you a couple of stories. I interview by now some like 40-something families and their experience in choosing schools and ended up in particular in zero tolerance charter schools. Um, and in these charter schools, they to mirror some echo some of the things that Jesse was saying, that schools look more like prison. They ask students, for example, to do this called tracking, that the teacher makes a sign and everybody needs to follow with their eyes the teacher wherever they go. They make students walk in line through painted lines through the hallway quietly. They also gives, of course, this is coupled with a lack of educational supports, not just for students with disabilities, for all students, and demands high academic practices. On top of that, those schools were giving demerits to kids for misbehaving, much like happened in the army on in prisons, and even more macabre even, and they have stopped this practice by now, but they were charging also parents when I was interviewing, like $5 for the kids when was not complying with some school practices. And this uh, um, relationship between high pressure to behave in particular ways, high pressure to perform academically in certain ways with absolutely little support, what it resulted in is in a huge detriment of students' health, but literally students' health. There were kids that out of anxiety, they were pulling out of their dreadlocks, like pulling out their hair out. There were kids who developed such an anxiety that have to be put in therapeutic facilities. There were kids who developed depression and would not wake up, would not stand up out of their bed because what they have, the trauma they have experienced at those schools. So it's just want to expand it. Yes, of course, the direction and the nexus with prison is very important, but the damage that we're doing to people's well-being through these practices goes well beyond than placing them in or connecting them with this nexus towards prison.
So our next question is, going forward, do you see schools best accommodating students with disabilities when it comes to disciplinary actions in the classroom? And then the follow-up to that is, when asking schools for accountability or justice, what should the response look like? And Federico, can we start with you?
Yeah, and I'm going to commit the same heresy that I did before. I'm going to kind of rephrase your question again, because I don't like the word accommodate, because accommodate means that you're not willing to transform and change, right? You're willing to let somebody in a little bit, we tweak a little bit, we change a little bit things, but we're not really changing. We're welcoming you in a space that is not welcome, right? We're welcoming you and letting you in an oppressive space, an oppressive space. So I think we don't need to talk about how we accommodate. We need to think about how we transform schools more broadly. And many things have been said around that. And I can share how I think about transforming schools as how I've been thinking about in the last years. And I think in three ways that that I think it touched upon many things that were said before. First, I think, as Jesse was saying before, and with his fantastic story of the hole, I mean, I still wonder if they have fixed it yet.
I know.
That we need to justly redistribute resources and economic funding. And that does not just means give money to school. That also includes the way that we train teachers, the way that we distribute teachers in the district, in the way that we provide and develop teaching capacity to do this kind of work. Includes also resources I was saying before for nurses, for social workers, for school counselors, for the training needed to provide welcoming, spaces that develop well-being. We have in the United States and the most an equal way to fund schools. I don't know how much people knows how schools are funded, but out of the federal government funds are just about 16, 17% of a district budget. The large majority of school funding for schools come from property taxes. And of course, if you live in a wealthy district, in a wealthy area, you'll have way more resources than other areas. And that in the US becomes sometimes a matter of crossing an avenue, crossing a river, like in East and West St. Louis. So we need to begin to dismantle those structural forms of racism that goes back to how schools were segregated, how funding was distributed in that segregation context. I mean, I'm here in Spain. I tell people that most schools are funded by property taxes, and it's like jaw dropping. People, this is hard to conceive. It's like, what, the state's not giving you all the money for the schools? It's just no. Most of the schools money comes from property tax. So we need to start tackling economic issues. We need to start tackling cultural issues. We need to start broadening the ways that we think about what it means to be a human being, a student, the cultural repertoires and ability repertoires that we value, privilege, and use for learning purposes in schools. We need to change the kind of assessment that we have, because all this entangling of racism and ableism also inform the assessments that we have in school. We need to change the curriculum, the assessment, and we also, just to wrap up, we need to change the forms of governance that schools have. We need to change the way that we let people represent schools. And we need to provide students and parents and community members to be key stakeholders and key participation in decision-making in school, trying to figure out the forms of exclusion that schools experience and students experience themselves, and the ways to solve them as well. And I'm gonna stop there and I'll let other people talk.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I completely agree. We have to transform the tax structure, and it can't be about rich neighborhoods getting the resources their kids need and the rest of us scrambling to figure out how to have the basics of an education for our kids, right? And so I think that is a struggle that I'm committed to, and that we need to hold politicians accountable for. You know, President Biden said he was going to triple Title I funding. And so, you know, he was pushed to do that by more radical movements. And now it's time to hold him accountable to that. And that would just be a very beginning, right? That doesn't change the funding structure of our schools that create poverty in the first place, right? So all that needs to happen. But I also want to reimagine what's in our schools. I agree with Federico. We need to transform assessment, because right now, high stakes standardized testing is driving what kids are learning in schools. The average student in the United States takes 112 standardized tests in their K-12 career, so that every month students are preparing for the next exam. And so that testing corporations like Pearson are deciding what's an important and valuable education instead of educators deciding that. And we know that these standardized tests were invented by eugenicists in the early 1900s. People like Carl Brigham, who was a Princeton professor who invented the SAT exam, also wrote a book called The Study in American Intelligence, which was a manifesto for the white supremacist movement of eugenicists, right? So that has a really ugly history of standardized testing. And we know those tests measure your ability to eliminate wrong answer choices. It measures, probably above all else, your zip code is what researchers have shown. It measures your access to resources, not your intelligence, not your aptitude, and not the skills that you've learned. And then in addition, I think we need schools that are about rethinking what knowledge is. And right now, knowledge is measured in test scores and grades. But I want us to see our schools think about, how do we solve problems in our world? And what if we got rid of the segregation of the subjects? So we didn't have math class and science class and language arts class. What if we had a class called, Should We Defund the Police? I bet a lot of kids would take that. And in that course, you could learn math, right? And in fact, there's a brilliant math teacher at my school who led the students in a discussion about the city budget and had the kids re-envision the city budget that by far was the vast majority was spent on policing, right? And the students could learn history by learning the history of policing in this country and how it emerged from slave patrols in the South and in the North from strike-breaking brigades, right? And how you could learn language arts by looking at the poetry of resistance to policing, right? Or writing speeches that you deliver to the city council about your findings about the budget, right? So we could have problem-based learning that was relevant to the problems in our society, and then education could be about solving the real issues that we face in our world today.
I think that's an incredible thought. I think critical thinking is something that I think the school system sometimes tends to stray away from, and is so very important, especially during a time like today when students are going to need some of those critical thinking skills to become important members of our society. With that, at this time, we will be taking questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A feature below to ask your question, and we will read them out. And we do have a question from the audience for the panelists. The question is, how would you address the, I believe they meant to say, systemic violence being committed against Black students nationwide? Professor Subini, I see you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Thanks. And Shukri, thank you so much for that comment about needing critical thinking that you built off of Jesse from, because really you're reflecting what James Baldwin talked about in his really famous talk, A Talk to Teachers, right? Where he says, we really need these critically educated people, but no society actually wants a critically educated person, because then they're going to turn around and question what's going on. But we actually do want that, right? And when he says no society, he's talking about the state, the power brokers, the people who want to keep things just as the status quo. So I think that's a really important piece. And this epistemic violence that the person asks about is a really important thing. I'm going to return a little bit to the question of going forward. How do we see what happens in schools? I love the idea of changing structures of funding that Federico brought up, and how Jesse kind of shifted the scale into what is happening in our classrooms and discussed assessments and teaching across disciplines. And I'm going to move our spatial lens. So we went from this to this, and now I'm going to move from general ed to special ed, because I'm going to keep pulling us back to what happens to our most marginalized students. So I'm talking about our Black students with disabilities. I'm talking about our Black queer students, our students who are being pushed again to the margins. And I really love this idea of transformation that Federico brought up as well, because I agree, we can't just accommodate. It's time to really, like in my mind, this is where abolition can really inform us. And I wrote a op-ed with Dave Stovall about this idea that we can abolish schools and rethink education. So abolishing schooling as we know it, as this thing where we sit in desks and that we raise our hands and all of this stuff that was created during the Industrial Revolution, that we can rethink these things if we bring our imagination to it. So, but returning to this idea that special ed often means remedial curriculum, problematic pedagogy, and retributive relationships, I want us to not pretend that disability overrides every other identity, because then disabled kids of color are often treated like white disabled kids. And when that doesn't work, then they're considered broken and they're pushed out even of special ed. So the idea that disabled kids of color don't need engaging curriculum, productive pedagogy, and caring relationships. So I want all of us who care about Black Lives Matter in schools to include disability, ableism, and special education in their work. For educators, this can be thinking about who is in our curriculum and representing them with their whole selves. So I always give the example of like Rosa Parks, right? So Rosa Parks refused to sit down on the bus, but first of all, she had this huge lineage of activism. It wasn't just some random thing she did. But also, Rosa Parks talks about in her later life how deeply psychologically wounded she became from that incident, because she then went to go work at the back at her department store and nobody would speak to her for at least 2 weeks, and then they fired her, and how deeply psychologically wounding that work became for her. And so, like, do we talk about that part of what it is that sometimes resistance causes, like, not the resistance, but the resistance to the system then harms you when you resist. Or Fannie Lou Hamer, right? So Fannie Lou Hamer was a Black woman. Lots of people think of her as one of the mothers of the civil rights movement. That's amazing. But do we know that Fannie Lou Hamer had polio as a child, had a limp as a child, and that also when she was beaten so severely in a Mississippi jail that she then had struggled to walk? Do we know that Fannie Lou Hamer had something called the Mississippi appendectomy, which was a forced sterilization? And so all these ways that changed the way she organized. So it's not just saying, oh, look, disability label, everybody's disabled, yippee, yippee, but it's much more like, wow, how does disability, ability, and ableism impact the ways that people of color experience the world and inform their resistance, right? Because Fannie Lou Hamer was known for going and taking a chair and sitting among people and talking with them. And how much did that have to do with the fact that literally she struggled to walk? And that's not a bad thing, right? It's not a deficit. When we only see her as deficit, we lose all of the ways that informed who she was. When we understand that she fought against the Mississippi appendectomy, she talked about it on the floor, you know, like she talked about it in national conventions. She talked about being forcibly sterilized. So that was part of her organizing ethos. And so really thinking about how we can include these marginalizations into our curriculum and not be afraid of them, and refuse the deficit framing that we've been handed over time. How we can make our stuff more accessible, and then relationships being in solidarity with kids, right? And that's one of the things I want us to be thinking about as educators is how are we actually in solidarity? How do we bring some humility and realize that multiply marginalized youth know things that we don't know? So all of those things I think could really shift the way that Black youth experience epistemic violence in the classroom and in schools.
Absolutely. Do any of the other panelists want to answer that question about systemic or epistemic violence being committed against Black students nationwide?
I mean, I guess I will just add real quick that until we abolish a system of white supremacy and racial capitalism in this country, we're going to have violence against Black children. And it's sad to say, because that's a monumental task, right? And it requires much more than a training for this officer or, anti-bias training for these educators, right? It requires undoing an entire system and replacing it. And that's a lot of work, but we can't solve the problem until we identify the problem and look the problem squarely in the face. And that will require an immense uprising. It will require something far larger than even the civil rights and Black Power era. It will require an overturning of this system done by millions of people linking arms across different categories and seeing the commonalities and working together in solidarity to transform our society.
Okay, Professor Federico, do you have anything?
No, I think that was a great way to wrap up the question.
Wonderful. And with that is the last question that we have for this evening. And I invite all of the panelists to share their last thoughts. So we'll start with Professor Federico, and then we'll go Professor Subini, and then Teacher Jessie.
Well, it's been a huge learning experience to be here and listening from Subini and Jessie. How to wrap this up? There were so many ideas, so it was so many enticing, captive ideas that I go back to how I started. That and it goes to what very similar Jesse just wrapped it up a few minutes ago, talking about that we need to dismantle the system based in white supremacy and ableism. I think there, as Subini was saying before, I think I completely agree with her with that. I think they are like two chains of a DNA. You know, they're deeply entangling, informing practices and policies. And until we don't tackle that, until we don't start unpacking why we have the practices, educational practices, policy practices, discipline practices, and when we have the policies that we have, like funding policies, assessment and standardized assessment policies, we don't start unpacking where those coming from and who are benefiting, and the consequences of having those as related to this tight thread of ableism and racism. We're gonna keep running in loops like hamsters in a little wheel, because we're always gonna be trying to put band-aids and fixing things in very cosmetic ways. So I think we need to take it back to the issue of policing. I brought back the questions that started tonight for me. Sorry, it's like 11:40 here. Where are we policing? What are we protecting so much? And we need to wrap up with that.
First of all, Federico, just salute that you're doing this so late at night. I can't even like wrap my head around it. I would be a pile. Second of all, man, this panel has been a joy. I've been snapping so much that my fingers are now hurting, and I think I'm gonna have to like go have a glass of wine to strengthen them back up. But all that to be said, I don't think I have much to say. I mean, I always say that and then I say a whole bunch, but I'll try to keep it short. One, I really believe in the idea of intersectionality that Kimberly Crenshaw told us about, right? And many people before her, just to be clear, there's a whole lineage of Black feminist thought that tells us about understanding race and gender, but it's also about understanding intersecting oppressions. So racism and ableism and sexism, right? And cis heteropatriarchy, those are the things that we need to understand. So I want us to think about that and start with the multiply marginalized. So even when we talk about Black folks, there are people within it that have certain amounts of privilege. And I want us to look, instead of at the center, to say the margins. Her original piece was called Mapping the Margins. It was about understanding people at the margins who are being pushed out of society. And if we can actually understand those folks and recenter our work on those folks, I think it would shift. The other thing is, I feel like sometimes when I'm in these things, I'm like, ooh, that sounds interesting. That, like school funding, assessment. And I start like getting kind of like a kid in a candy store who's like a little excited but overwhelmed too. Like there's too much to do. But like, I think also, so I always think of Mariam Akaba, who's a abolitionist who I've learned a lot from. And one of the things she says is just pick one thing and look around and see who's doing it already. Because you just discovered it doesn't mean no one's doing work on it. Right? So somebody is doing work on this. We all have these real specialty things we do. So look around, see what work is being done, and then learn how you can help. Not how you can jump forward and take the lead, but how you can support the work that's already being done and geographically close to you or emotionally close to your heart. But I think that really shifts this kind of like abolish white supremacy, which is like, how do I do that, to starting really like localized, and that'll shift the way that you start that, because that moves me from kind of a helpless moment to like, okay, I can do this one thing. So, whatever is your focus, like I always pick on teacher ed programs because I'm in a teacher ed program. So I have the power to change teacher ed programs, right? And so like, whatever your thing is, think about that and what you can do with it.
Yes. Well, I can't wait to look up your all scholarship because I've already learned a lot, but I'm looking forward to diving deeper into it. So thank you. It's been great to be part of this panel. I completely agree that the framework of intersectionality and the Black feminist tradition that has given us a way to analyze society and the multiple oppressions and privileges is really, I think, an important starting place for everybody who wants to transform society. So going back to Sojourner Truth and seeing her statement, "Ain't I a woman?" and seeing how her Blackness and being a woman intersected for her specific oppression. And Claudia Jones, who brought in the socialist revolutionary analysis with Black feminism. And I think going and looking at the Combahee River Collective and looking at the work of Barbara Smith and how they were able to bring that to the movement in the 60s and 70s, and Kimberly Crenshaw, all of that work has been so important for me to understand the students that I'm teaching and how to meet their needs, but also the structures in our society that are creating these overlapping forms of oppression and privilege, and the structure of capitalism that I think undergirds it all, that we have to take a look at squarely. And I guess I just want to end by saying that one of the I think most problematic aspects of schooling in our society is the way it teaches us all to think as individuals. It teaches us to compete as individuals. It teaches us to compete with your classmates for grades, for test scores, for slots in schools. And it teaches us history through the lens of individuals. It usually teaches us that great white men were the people that created history. They had ideas, and these wonderful ideas led them to act on them and then to change the world. And in fact, that's all completely backwards, because the greatest changes that have been created in our society have been collective changes. They've been the changes of the many who have found the courage to link arms with each other, sometimes across differences, and rise up and transform our world, right? That's how women won the right to vote in this country, right? That's how Black people fought back and led the biggest general strike in US history when they deserted plantations during the Civil War and helped to lead to the victory to the North, right? That's how Black people finally won the right to vote in the Voting Rights Act with the civil rights movement, right? It's been the power of collective struggle. And so I want to urge people to move from the study group and sessions like this on your own to joining in organizations or creating new ones and linking arms with people and getting in a struggle, right? And actually fighting for the changes that we need, not just understanding it. So thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, for this very, very beautiful, enlightening panel. I am really emotional right now, so I am going to read off of my script for everyone, so please bear with me. Today has been informative. I've been listening to this conversation nonstop for the last 6 hours, so I'm trying to have some grace with myself right now. There's so much that I can say and not enough to be said. We have heard from abolitionists, from activists, from scholars, educators, Afrofuturists, Black feminists, co-conspirators, basically a community of dedicated spirits and leaders pushing to make our communities and our schools a safe zone from the terror of police, while also dreaming up, advocating for, and creating alternative pathways to self-policing our communities and our schools with community. What is safety? What is being protected? Who is being protected? Who is being targeted? What is being targeted? What is at the heart of this conversation? Echoing many of our invited panelists, do we need policing as it stands today? My answer is no. It does more harm than it heals. And like what was said earlier, our communities and our schools need healing. They need to be spaces of healing. The institution of policing and police as it stands right now, today, as we heard, things are happening today within the hours, is deeply associated with violence. Anytime we try to solve problems with police, we are trying to solve those problems with violence. Does that make sense? Schools in our communities need to be locations of healing so they can become locations of learning. Dr. Morris, our keynote speaker, mentioned this today, and I will echo the hell out of that statement all day long. Black and brown bodies do not require remedy. They do not require policing. How do we remedy the structure of systemic racism? How do you go beyond engaging in this repetitive push to make sense of this? We need to get past that. There's no making sense of it. Today, this week, this year has been hard and heavy for a lot of us, including myself. My Black and brown communities, please have grace with yourself. Remember to take space, to take a second, to breathe, to find moments of joy, to drink water, nourish yourself. This is a marathon and it will require a tank of energy that is not on E to keep moving forward. For my non-Black and brown folks, for our white allies, our academic departments, our school leaders, anyone who has been listening to the realities of our Black and brown communities today, I challenge you. Real talk, like there is no time for passiveness. There is no making sense of this. There's only making. What will we truly make when we fully invest your spirit, your time, your energy, and your pockets to this work? Like it was also said earlier, get involved. How can you support the work that is already being done right now today? And how do you do that within your communities to make your communities right here in the proximity for us here in Syracuse models for change? I think I'm just gonna leave like on that. So that concludes our event for the evening. Please join us tomorrow at 10 a.m. For our final panel. It's gonna be with Syracuse specific community leaders tackling that conversation of how can we make our city a model. This is open to anyone who wants to come, not just from people from Syracuse. Please come ready with questions and inquiries and love and support so we can really dig at the heart of really changing the culture that is just doing a lot of damage to the people who are suffering beneath those margins. That link is different from today, just a housekeeping thing. And if you can't figure out how to join tomorrow, please send an email to the Lender Center and reach out. If you have any questions or if you need any type of links to support, if you want more resources for this, this will be coming out after the recording comes out. So we are here as a resource, this center, for you guys to reach out and get involved. So thank you again for coming today. And we really, really appreciate you all staying on with us. And thank you so much to every single panelist that we had today. I love y'all. I will be sending personal emails to each and every one of you. So thank you so much. And to our moderators, you did an amazing job.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you to the moderators and interpreters. We appreciate your labor.
Thank you.
No doubt. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.